The heavy wooden doors of room 2141 slammed shut, and for the next 4 hours, what happened inside would remain hidden from the American people. But Dan Goldman knew exactly what game was being played, and when those doors finally opened, his message was crystal clear. This secrecy isn't about oversight, it's about control. Picture this scene. Jack Smith, the man who spent years building cases that could have changed American history, sitting across from Republican lawmakers in a windowless room where cameras aren't allowed and transcripts disappear into partisan hands, no C-SPAN coverage, no public record, just shadows and selective leaks. Goldman emerged from that sealed chamber with fire in his voice and accusations that should make every American pause. It is absolutely absurd that the chairman is not having this testimony in public, he declared, his frustration cutting through the marble corridors of power. But here's what Goldman really exposed and why Jim Jordan's strategy reveals more than any transcript ever could. Jack Smith spent 2 years investigating the most powerful man in America. His work produced indictments so detailed, so evidence-heavy, that Goldman claims they would have resulted in convictions at trial. Yet when Smith finally speaks under oath about that work, about the accusations of political bias that have followed him for months, the American people are locked out. Why? Goldman has a theory, and it's darker than simple partisan theater. The majority is most likely going to selectively release parts of the transcript to create some false inference of improper conduct, Goldman warned. Think about that methodology. Control the room, control the questions, control what gets released, control the narrative. This isn't accountability, this is narrative engineering. During those 4 hours, Smith apparently dismantled every accusation thrown at him. No political bias, no partisan considerations, just a career prosecutor following evidence wherever it led. Goldman described Smith as someone who prosecuted thousands of cases in a completely impartial way and did the same thing here. But here's the twist that should terrify anyone who believes in transparency. Volume 2 of Smith's report, the portion that allegedly contains his most damning findings about Trump's conduct, remains buried. Not because Smith refuses to release it, not because of executive privilege, but because a federal judge in Florida has been sitting on the request for nearly a year. Goldman called it absolutely unacceptable. But it's more than that, it's strategic suppression of evidence that the public has a right to see. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you consider what happened immediately after Trump returned to office. Cases against Trump's co-defendants, cases that Goldman says had no reason to be dismissed based on evidence, facts, or law, were suddenly dropped. Not because prosecutors discovered new exonerating evidence, not because legal standards had changed, but because political power had shifted. Donald Trump clearly did that to conceal his own misconduct, Goldman stated. Let that sink in. The man who was investigated used presidential power to erase cases against his associates, removing potential witnesses who could have testified against him. This is where Goldman's criticism transcends partisan politics and enters constitutional territory. He pointed out something that should alarm every American, regardless of party affiliation. Jack Smith is the only special counsel in modern history who hasn't been given a public hearing, the only one whose full report hasn't been released to Congress. That's not coincidence, that's coordination. Mueller testified publicly. Starr testified publicly. Even prosecutors in cases involving classified materials have found ways to testify publicly while protecting sensitive information. But Smith, hidden behind closed doors while Republicans control both the questions and the disclosure. Goldman's demand was simple. I demand that the chairman have a subsequent public hearing so that the American people can hear what the special counsel said, so they can see his demeanor, and so they can understand the truth about Smith's investigation. Because here's what Jordan's secrecy actually reveals. If Republicans genuinely believed Smith had abused his authority, committed prosecutorial misconduct, or acted with political bias, they would want his testimony broadcast live to every American. They would want his credibility destroyed in public. They would want his explanations dissected by journalists and legal experts in real time. Instead, they chose darkness. They chose control. They chose the ability to frame Smith's words without allowing Americans to judge his credibility for themselves. The real story emerging from room 2141 isn't what Smith said during 4 hours of questioning. It's what the secrecy itself tells us about who has something to hide. Goldman made clear that Smith's investigations were thorough, evidence-based, and professional, the kind that typically result in convictions. The only reason Trump didn't face trial, according to Goldman, was because of the Supreme Court and because of the timing of Trump becoming president again. But timing and legal technicalities don't erase evidence. They don't change facts. They don't transform guilt into innocence. What they do is provide cover for political actors who prefer narrative control over factual transparency. Jim Jordan's closed-door strategy tells us everything we need to know about the strength of his accusations against Smith. If you have truth on your side, you don't hide in the shadows. You don't ration transcripts. You don't suppress reports that the public funded and deserves to see. You shine lights. You open doors. You let evidence speak for itself. The fact that Jordan chose the opposite approach should tell every American exactly what he really fears. Not that Jack Smith committed misconduct, but that the American people might discover he didn't. But there's more to this story than political theater and procedural disputes. Goldman's revelations paint a picture of systematic obstruction that extends far beyond a single closed-door hearing. Consider the timeline Goldman revealed. Jack Smith spent months building what he described as lengthy and extensive investigations that produced indictments so bulletproof they virtually guaranteed convictions. These weren't rushed prosecutions or politically motivated fishing expeditions. These were the kind of methodical, evidence-heavy cases that career prosecutors build when they know they're going to face the most scrutinized defense teams money can buy. Yet when Smith finally gets the opportunity to defend his work under oath, to address the character assassination that's followed him for months, Republicans choose to muzzle him behind closed doors. Think about the optics of that choice. If your accusations against someone are true, you want the world to hear their weak denials. If your accusations are fabricated, you want to control how their strong rebuttals are presented. Goldman described Smith's demeanor during the deposition as calm, professional, and unshakable. Jack Smith is an outstanding prosecutor, Goldman emphasized, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed the testimony firsthand. He never used any political bias. He never made any political considerations, made that very clear. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Goldman revealed that Smith specifically addressed the timing of his cases, explaining how external factors, not prosecutorial weakness, prevented trials from reaching their natural conclusion. The Supreme Court's intervention wasn't based on evidence or legal merit, according to Smith's testimony. It was procedural protection that allowed Trump to escape accountability through electoral timing rather than legal vindication. This distinction matters because it exposes the real strategy at work. Republicans aren't trying to prove Smith committed misconduct. They're trying to create enough doubt about his motivations that Americans forget about the evidence he uncovered. It's not about clearing Trump's name through facts. It's about muddying the waters through insinuation. Goldman's warning about selective transcript release reveals sophisticated narrative manipulation. Imagine having 4 hours of testimony where Smith systematically dismantles every accusation against him, then watching Republicans release only the questions while withholding the answers, or releasing fragments of responses without the context that gives them meaning. That's not oversight, that's propaganda production. The historical context Goldman provided should alarm anyone who cares about institutional integrity. Special counsels have operated under the principle of public accountability since the position was created. From Watergate to Whitewater to the Russia investigation, these prosecutors have faced public scrutiny as a democratic safeguard. They testify openly precisely because their power demands transparency. But Jim Jordan broke that precedent without explanation or justification. No national security concerns, no classified material complications, just a unilateral decision to shield a public official from public accountability while simultaneously attacking his credibility. Goldman's reference to Volume 2 of Smith's report exposes another layer of obstruction. For nearly a year, critical findings about Trump's conduct have remained buried not because of legal necessity, but because of judicial foot-dragging. That judge in Florida isn't protecting national security or due process. She's providing political cover by denying Americans access to information they funded and deserve to see. The dismissal of cases against Trump's co-defendants represents perhaps the most damning revelation of all. Goldman made clear these weren't close calls where prosecutors had legitimate discretion. These were strong cases with solid evidence that were eliminated purely for political convenience. Think about what that means for future prosecutions. If evidence doesn't matter when defendants have political connections, if cases can be dismissed based on electoral outcomes rather than legal merit, then the rule of law becomes meaningless for the powerful while remaining ruthlessly enforced for everyone else. Goldman's call for a public hearing isn't just about fairness to Smith, it's about preserving the principle that government officials must answer to the people they serve. When prosecutors operate in secret, when investigations disappear behind partisan walls, when evidence becomes a political commodity rather than a constitutional requirement, democracy doesn't just suffer, it dies. The choice facing America is stark. Citizens can demand the transparency that democracy requires, or they can accept the narrative control that authoritarianism provides. They can insist on seeing the evidence for themselves, or they can trust political actors to interpret it for them. Jim Jordan's closed-door strategy reveals which side of that choice he's made. His secrecy speaks louder than any accusation because it demonstrates a fear of public scrutiny that innocent actors don't possess. Dan Goldman emerged from room 2141 not just defending Jack Smith, but defending the principle that Americans deserve to judge their government's actions for themselves. In a democracy, that principle isn't negotiable. Democracy dies in darkness, and Dan Goldman just illuminated exactly who's controlling the light switch.